Thanks for joining us today. We're having our pro series on what goes on in the real estate transaction once you get to the point of an accepted offer. We have Jason Zegans here of Zegans Law Firm, and let's just get right into it. So, I call you and I say, hey, my guys we just have an accepted offer. They're going to buy this house.
Right.
And obviously there's some differences as when you get into house versus condo versus co-op, and we can talk about that quickly because I know there's not a big difference, but let's talk about how your involvement as a lawyer goes from there.
Absolutely. So, my primary role once you have an accepted offer on a house, condo, co-op, whatever the case might be, is really to come in and try to, really represent the purchaser in doing a couple different functions.
Okay.
So there's really, to me, three parts of a real estate transaction.
Right.
Two are up front. One is obviously the closing at the end.
Okay.
Obviously when you get there. But up front you have contract negotiation.
Okay.
And due diligence. Okay.
All right.
So the contract, for the most part, here in New York City, at least on a condo, a co-op, and even a single-family home, we can get to some of the differences in a little bit, is fairly a standard form document that almost every attorney uses. Okay. So the contract process part, in my opinion, is fairly easy.
You see one, you see them all.
Right. You see one, you see them all. A lot of it is, reiterating the deal points that have been accepted, making sure you get the timing for your client down pat to close within the client's expectations.
Right.
And really just making sure that the negotiated deal is properly memorialized within the contract.
Okay.
Okay. So we do that all day, every day.
Right.
Easy for us to do. Fairly easy to work with the client to make sure they understand the contract and just understand what they're comfortable, what they're signing, so that they're comfortable signing it.
Got it.
More importantly, in my opinion, is the due diligence process, which is sometimes, maybe in some people's opinion, underlooked a little bit, or underappreciated. The importance of really doing good due diligence.
Mm-hmm.
But from our perspective, due diligence is really surrounding on looking into really the financials of the building.
Okay.
Right. So you're looking at, what are you buying?
Okay.
And because you're not buying, well, if you're buying a single family home, you're buying the existing structure.
Correct.
Right? You're buying the roof, you're buying the foundation, you need to do an inspection report and know everything about that.
Right.
In a condo or a co-op, it's a little bit different because you're purchasing a unit within a building, right? So you don't have the general upkeep and maintenance responsibility of the building, the structure, the roof.
You don't own the mechanicals.
You don't own anything, right? You own a piece of, 4 walls within a building, piece of, real estate in the sky.
Got it.
So you want to look into the financials of the building in terms of their operational history. What's their history of maintenance increases? History of assessments issued to, the shareholders or condominium unit owners.
Okay.
Meaning that an assessment is usually, instituted for a capital need. So, for instance, they need to replace the roof, for example.
Right.
They have two different methods. One, they could take money from their operating or their reserve funds if there is enough money, right? Or issue an assessment. So that goes and says, we need $100,000. We divide that by 100 unit owners in the building, and everybody pays $2,000 over the course of X amount of months.
Right.
So that's a capital assessment. So really, you're looking at operational history of the building to see maintenance increases over the last several years, assessments over the last several years. You want to know the reserve, the money that the building has in reserve, so you know how much money they have to use at some point in the future when capital improvement projects come up.
Right. For that rainy day.
Yeah, for that rainy day, because if they don't have enough money in the reserve, at some point it's going
to have an assessment.
Exactly. So you're really looking at, from my perspective, financials, history, and upcoming repairs, renovations, capital improvement projects, and things that are likely to cost money to the building and thus the shareholders / unit owners of the building.
Right.
So that's a lot of the meat and potatoes of really, what you're looking at, so that your client can go in saying, I know I'm paying X amount of dollars for this apartment, I know what the maintenance is, I know how much money I make, and this is what I can afford.
Right.
And then later down the road, there's not, a tremendous amount of surprise whereby they come back and all of a sudden maintenance goes up, common charges goes up, they institute a capital assessment and all of a sudden they can't afford it. So it's really just being informed and knowing what you're buying and the financial wherewithal of the building to pay for the unknown and deal with the unknown coming up in the future.
Got it. So in a situation where you have a building that's not well managed, and you go in and you read the minutes, you're doing your due diligence, and you're like, ugh. What happens then? What does your conversation with your client look like?
I mean, it's a tough conversation,
right?
Because at the end of the day, you have to properly represent your client and advise them of the fact that this building is not either the most well-run, the management, from a management perspective, or the financial risks associated with, upcoming events.
Right.
But the way we really approach it is we take, the role of advising the client of what's out there,
right.
And from there, them making a decision. But usually what I say to them is, if you were the client, you're the only one that knows what else you've seen, what other apartments you've looked at, right? So you have to, use one apartment as a benchmark versus the other,
right.
And say, listen, what's the risks I'm telling you about.
Mm-hmm.
I'm advising you that the X, Y, and Z, maybe the the maintenance has increased 10% over the last 4 years, and thus it's likely going to continue in the future.
Right.
You need to sit down and look at it and say, based on all that, do I think I'm getting a good deal, and am I willing to move forward with this transaction based on the perceived risk coming up in the future versus your opinion on whether or not you think you're getting a good deal. I mean, that's kind of how I treat, those hairier buildings where you have some uncertainty or, financial instability.
Right.
Really let the client make a decision because they're the only ones that can know how much risk they're willing to, take on, right?
Right. So then so the next step would be your final involvement at the actual closing.
Right. So we do all the due diligence aside from reading the financials, reviewing the offering plan, and all that. We negotiate the contract. Once you're in contract, depending whether it's a cash offer or whether they're getting financing. If they're getting financing, of course, we'll help them through the financing process.
Right.
Any commitment issues that might come up. Really, we're kind of in waiting mode for you as the real estate broker to tell us that either to submit the board package, whether it's a condo or a co-op, and let us know, hey, we got approved, and now let's start setting up a closing, and that really comes the last third of the transaction.
Right.
So it's contract due diligence, closing, and then we set up a closing date, start working on closing figures and adjustments and check requests and all that good stuff.
And then it's just they sit there and sign for about an hour.
An hour to more.
In some cases,
more.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I would say generally like an hour to 2 hours. It really depends if there's financing. It's a cash deal. We walk in, we sign. It's a condo. We sign a deed. We sign some transfer tax returns, and we're out of there. Every time we say this is going to be a quick one, knock on wood, it turns out not to be.
Right.
But a financing transaction, anywhere from an hour and a half to 2.5 hours, solely because we have to sit. I review the loan documents with the borrower, make sure they understand the note and corollary documents, and then the bank has to approve the transaction before they fund the loan.
Right.
That sometimes could take a little bit longer than anticipated, but yeah, generally an hour and a half to 2 hours.
Cool. Well, listen, thank you for joining us. As always, if you have any questions, please post in the comments below. Follow me on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, Snapchat, Instagram, and Twitter. See you all soon, guys.